Hi, today we're going to compare two new 50mm lenses that were recently announced by Sigma in early 2023. The first is the Sigma 50mm f1.4 DG-DN art lens, and the second is the 50mm f2 DG-DN contemporary lens. So let's take a look. In early April 2023, Sigma introduced three compact lenses. The 17mm f4 DG-DN lens that we shall review in a separate video, the 50mm f2 DG-DN that we shall be testing today, and the Sigma 23mm f1.4 DC DN APS-C lens. Just a few weeks prior to this announcement, the company introduced another 50mm lens, the 50mm f1.4 DG-DN art lens. This gave us a chance to compare the two 50mm lenses, which is what we shall be doing in this video. Let's start as always with the optical design. The 50mm f2 has an optical design which includes 11 elements in 9 groups with 1 SLD and 3 aspherical elements. The 50mm f1.4 has a more complex optical design which includes 14 elements in 11 groups with 1 SLD and 3 aspherical elements. The 50mm f2 has the same fantastic metal design and build as the rest of the Sigma I series of lenses, and it is fairly compact. The 50mm f1.4 on the other hand is a much bigger and bulkier lens, similar to other recent art series lenses, but with a few additions that we shall discuss in a moment. The 50mm f2 is a very light lens at under 350 grams. It is also pretty compact at about 8.5 centimeters long. The 50mm f1.4 is a more substantial lens at around 660 grams, and it is also much longer at about 12 centimeters. The 50mm f2 has a fairly narrow focus ring in the front and a very thin aperture ring closer to the camera. The focus ring is very well dampened and the aperture ring moves in clicks only. The 50mm f1.4 has a very wide focus ring in the front and a narrow aperture ring in the back. The focus ring has slightly more resistance to it compared to the f2 version, and the aperture ring can also be declicked for video shooting. The 50mm f2 has a single AF/MF switch. We would really like Sigma to start adding an aperture lock and a declick switch to this line. Luckily, both of these are present on the 50mm f1.4 as well as an AF/MF switch and a programmable AFL button. Both lenses are marketed as dust and moisture resistant with rubber gasket at the back. At the moment, both lenses come in a full-frame E-mount and L-mount variants. The 50mm f2 has the same metal hood as the rest of the I series, adding around 4 cm to the length of the lens. The 50mm f1.4 has a much larger plastic hood which adds 6 cm. It also has a release button, which is a nice touch. The 50mm f2 has 9 aperture blades, while the 50mm f1.4 has 11 aperture blades. We shall see later on in this review how both perform in terms of bokeh. The 50mm f2 has a small and not so common 58mm front filter thread. The 50mm f1.4 has a much larger 72mm front filter thread. Now let's move over to performance, and we shall start with focusing. We tested the focusing of both lenses. The 50mm f2 focused very quickly and precisely in good lighting conditions on our A1 in video mode, but struggled a bit in very low lighting conditions. In stills, it also struggled a bit in low light, but it was accurate in both situations. The 50mm f1.4 seemed even faster to focus and had no issues focusing both in good lighting conditions or in very low lighting conditions in stills or in video. We also tested the focus throw of both lenses, and sadly, like all other Sigma lenses that we have tested to date, they do not have a linear focus throw, which means that you won't be able to achieve a precise repeated focus pulls when shooting video. Both lenses have no built-in optical image stabilization, so you will have to rely on sensor stabilization instead. We tested the sharpness of both lenses using our special large professional Imates high-end chart on our Sony A1. The Sigma 50mm f2 is quite sharp wide open with a small improvement at around f2.8 in the center. In the corners the lens is not as sharp, with an improvement between f4 and f5.6. The 50mm f1.4 has so-so sharpness wide open in the center with huge improvement at around f2. The corners are actually fairly sharp even wide open, but they do get significantly brighter as you close down. We recently completed a review of the Samyang 50mm f1.4 Mark II lens, and since we have it for a few more days, we compared it to the new Sigma 50mm f1.4, and you can see the results wide open, both in the center where the Sigma seems to have a small advantage over the Samyang, as well as in the corners where the Sigma seems to have a big advantage over the Samyang lens. The 50mm f2 has an official minimum close-up focusing distance of 45 cm with a maximum macro magnification of 1 to 6.9. The 50mm f1.4 has the same official minimum close-up focusing distance of 45 cm and a maximum macro magnification of 1 to 6.8. When it comes to sharpness close up, the 50mm f2 isn't very sharp wide open in the center of the frame, but improves considerably as you stop down. The corners, however, stays pretty blurry even at f5.6. The 50mm f1.4 also isn't very sharp wide open, but improves considerably in the center starting from around f2. The corners improves quite a bit starting from around f2.8. Both lenses seems to suffer from quite heavy breathing in our testing, as you can see in the video. The 50mm f2 seems to have chromatic aberrations well controlled in our longitudinal chromatic aberration test. The 50mm f1.4 demonstrated more or less the same performance. Both lenses seems to exhibit some flare when faced with bright front light sources with some purple and green tint, as well as quite a bit of haze, especially on the 50mm f2. With shading compensation turned off in the camera, the 50mm f2 has quite a lot of darkening in the corners wide open, which cleans up nicely between f2.8 and f4. The 50mm f1.4 has a ton of vignette wide open, which doesn't really go away completely, and when you close down to about f4, it is more visible than that of the 50mm f2. Looking at the geometric distortion of both lenses with the camera distortion compensation turned off, we see an interesting difference. The 50mm f2 has a fairly minor barrel distortion in our test, while the 50mm f1.4 on the other hand has a very pronounced pincushion distortion, which is quite surprising for a lens of this focal length. Moving over to bokeh, the 50mm f2 has fairly large bokeh circles, however they are not round or super clean wide open, although at f2.8 they improve considerably without losing too much of their original size. The 50mm f1.4 shows a similar pattern, however this starts at f1.4 with around f2 being the optimal aperture in terms of bokeh shape and size. We had both lenses for a very short time before they were announced, so here are just a couple of shots from both lenses. So let's conclude. Both of these new Sigma 50mm lenses impress us in their own way. The 50mm f2 has a fantastic build quality, very good image quality, and it is small and light and great for travel. The 50mm f1.4 is a faster lens and hence heavier, larger, and more expensive. But you do get what you pay for with this lens with useful features such as the aperture lock, declick mode, and a programmable AFL button. Image quality is also very good across the frame, and it is sharper than the 50mm f2 at f2 or the Samyang 50mm f1.4 Mark II wide open. Both lenses have some quirks and limitations that we have covered. Some can be overcome with camera corrections or in post, but none are really deal breakers in our view. As Sony shooters, we're living in a great time where we have a lot of 50mm lenses to choose from. After testing both of these 50mm Sigma lenses, we think that you can't really go wrong with any of them depending on your budget and your needs. Talking about budget, the 50mm f2 DG DN lens will start selling for $640, the 50mm f1.4 DG DN art lens currently sells for around $850, around $260 more than the Samyang 50mm f1.4 Mark II lens. So that was our comparison of the two new 50mm lenses by Sigma. You can check out the full review on LensVid.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. See you next time.